It begins as a small movement in the dark, water sliding through a tunnel bored straight through a mountain. The tunnel is not natural. It runs beneath the Hottentots Holland Range, east of the city, and the water inside it is going somewhere it would never have gone on its own. It fell as rain on the far side of those mountains. Left alone, it would have run south and east away from the city, into a river and out to sea. Instead, it is moving west, through rock, towards 4 million people who will never see it, never think about it, and will turn a tap this evening, fully expecting it to arrive. Above that tunnel, on the seaward side, stands one of the wettest places in southern Africa. Table Mountain catches close to 1,500 millimetres of rain in a year. That is more than London, more than Dublin. Cloud comes in off the cold Atlantic, strikes a wall of sandstone more than a kilometre high and is forced upward until it has no choice but to let go of what it carries. The mountain is soaked. It runs green in winter. Water comes off it in 100 small streams. And in the summer of 2018, the city at its foot came within roughly 90 days of shutting off its taps. Not rationing them, not reducing them, shutting them off.
The plan had a name: Day Zero. It had a threshold. The moment the 6 dams fell to 13.5% of their combined capacity, it had a map with 200 collection points marked on it. And it had an allocation: 25 litres per person per day. Collected by hand, carried home. It also had a date. The date moved several times. It was never further away than 4 months. Both of these things are true at the same time. The mountain above the city is among the wettest ground on the subcontinent, and the city below it came closer to running dry than any major city on Earth had come in living memory. Neither figure is exaggerated. Neither cancels the other. So what exactly does a city run out of? The countdown was real. It was not a slogan, and it was not invented for the crisis. It was an instrument, and it is still running today. Every week, the city publishes a single figure, the combined level of 6 dams expressed as 1%, not 6 numbers, 1. Because the 6 dams are not 6 separate supplies sitting in 6 separate valleys. They are one machine. That number is the most closely watched statistic in Cape Town. It sits above the weather forecast. People check it the way other cities check a share index. And for 3 years, they watched it fall. 92%, then 70, then 50, then 38, then 26. Below that lay the line. 13.5%. Not 0, because the last of the water in a dam cannot be taken. It lies below the intake, thick with silt, beneath the reach of the pumps. A dam reading 10% is, for every practical purpose, empty. So the countdown was never a countdown to an empty dam. It was a countdown to the moment the machinery could no longer lift what was left. And here is the part of it that almost nobody outside the city knows. The counting did not stop because it rained. The rain helped. It came late, and it came in the winter of that year, and it refilled what had been drawn down. But by the time the first serious cold front crossed the mountains, the city had already moved the line. It had bought itself months it did not have in January. It did that by changing the machine while the machine was still running. Some of the water that settled it was already inside the pipes, escaping through cracks nobody had found. Some of it was standing on a mountainside 40 kilometers away, in the roots of trees that had no business being there. And the water that mattered most, in the end, did not come from the sky at all. It came from land the city did not own, and it had to be pushed uphill to arrive. There is one more thing worth knowing before any of that. When a city is told to use less, the saving comes from wherever there is something to save. Gardens, swimming pools, long showers, second bathrooms. Which means that in Cape Town, the households that cut the most were the households that had the most to give. And the households already living on 10 litres a person had nothing to offer at all. That, too, is part of how this system works. To understand any of it, you have to start above the city, not in it. Because Cape Town's water problem was never really a Cape Town problem. Look at the rainfall figures across the peninsula and something strange appears. Table Mountain at 1,500 millimetres. The Cape Flats, the low sandy plain stretching east where most of the city's people actually live, around 500. 3 times the difference, across 20 kilometers of flat ground. This is orographic rainfall, and it is the founding fact of the entire system. Air carrying moisture cannot pass through a mountain, it has to climb. As it rises, it cools, and cool air holds less water than warm air, so the moisture condenses and falls, on the high ground, on the windward slope, on rock. Then the air descends the far side, warming and drying as it goes. By the time it reaches the flats, it has very little left to give. So the rain in this corner of Africa does not fall on the city. It falls on the mountains around the city, always has. And it falls in a window. Cape Town is the only major city in sub-Saharan Africa with a Mediterranean climate. Almost every other South African city, Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria, gets its rain in summer, in afternoon thunderstorms spread across 4 or 5 months of the year. Cape Town gets almost none in summer. Its water arrives between roughly May and September, carried in on cold fronts spinning up out of the South Atlantic. The rest of the year is warm, dry, windy, and beautiful, and gives the dams essentially nothing. 11 months of waiting, 3 months of rain. That is the rhythm the city was built on, and it has never changed. Which raises the question that the whole system exists to answer. If the rain falls on the wrong ground, at the wrong time of year, and nowhere near where 5 million people live, how does any of it reach a tap? The answer sits behind a mountain range, in a valley most Cape Townians have never visited. Teerwaterskloof. It is the largest dam in the system by a wide margin, 480 million cubic meters when full, roughly 41% of all the storage the city can draw on. More than any other single structure, this is Cape Town's water, and it is on the wrong side of the mountains. Teerwaterskloof lies inland, near Villiersdorp, dammed across the Zonderend River. The Zonderend does not flow to Cape Town. It never has. It runs east, through farmland, towards the Breeder and eventually the Indian Ocean, a couple of 100 kilometers from anywhere the city cares about. Left to geography, not one drop of that dam would ever reach a kitchen in Cape Town. So the water is taken. A tunnel runs from Teerwaterskloof through the Hottentots Holland Mountains. A bore cut through solid rock, moving water westward against the direction the land intends. It emerges on the seaward side, feeds through a balancing dam at Kleinplas, and runs down to a treatment works at 4 on the edge of the Cape Flats. From there, it enters the pipes. This is not an accident of engineering. It is the design principle of the entire supply. The formal name is the Rivier Zonderend Berg River Government Water Scheme, and it is an inter-basin transfer, a system that captures the flow of separate river catchments, the Zonderend, the Berg, the Eerste, and moves water between them through tunnels, canals, and pipelines, according to where the rain actually fell. Which means the 6 dams are genuinely one machine. Rain falls heavily on one catchment and lightly on another, and the system shifts water between them. A dam is not a supply, it is a node, and nodes can be rebalanced. There is something else about Teerwaterskloof that only becomes visible when it empties. It is shallow for its size, wide, spread across a broad valley floor with an enormous surface area relative to the volume it holds. In a hot, dry, relentlessly windy summer, that surface is exposed to the air for months at a time. A surface dam loses water simply by existing. It evaporates. On the worst days of a Cape summer, the dam is being emptied by the sky as fast as any household could empty it from a tap. When the level fell far enough in those last months, something appeared that nobody living had seen. Sand. Bare, white sand, kilometers of it, blowing in the wind like a dune field. Beneath it, the stumps of trees that had been drowned when the valley was flooded decades before, standing upright, grey, perfectly preserved, exposed to the light again after half a century. Photographs of that dam went around the world. They were read as photographs of a drought. They were also photographs of a design. Because there is a question buried in the shape of that valley, and it will matter later. Of the 6 dams in this system, one of them is not really a dam at all. It does something else entirely, something no other city in South Africa asks of its drinking water. We will come back to it. Follow the water down from Kleinplas and you arrive at the least photographed building in the story. Forey Water Treatment Works. 500 million litres a day at full capacity. It is the single largest works in the system, and most of the water pulled out of Tevatterskloof arrives here. It is busiest at 3 in the morning. Reservoirs across the city refill overnight while demand is low, so the plant runs hardest when the city it serves is asleep. Raw water comes in carrying silt, organic matter, and colour leached out of mountain fynbos. Tea-coloured, faintly acidic, unsuitable for anything. It is dosed with a coagulant, which makes the fine suspended particles clump together into flocks heavy enough to sink. Those settle out in long sedimentation basins. What remains passes through sand filtration, where the last of the fine material is stripped out. Then chlorine. Then the pumps. From that moment, the water is no longer in the natural world. It is inside a network, and the network is the part of the machine that will turn out to be the hardest to control. But before the pipes, there is one more thing to understand about where the water comes from. Not every dam in this system catches its own rain. North of the city, on a flat plain below the Fuelfle Mountains, lies a reservoir with a peculiar problem. Its own catchment is tiny, around 38 square kilometres, a fraction of what a dam that size would need to fill itself. Rain falling naturally into Fuelfle would take years to raise it, and evaporation would take much of that back before it ever became useful. So Fuelfle is not filled by its own sky. It is filled by diversion. Water is taken out of the Berg River upstream at a weir and carried into the dam through a canal. The reservoir sits off to one side of the river that supplies it, an off-channel dam holding water it never caught. Which means Fuelfle depends on a structure, not on weather, on a weir, a canal, and a decision about how much of a river to take and when. Take too little in a wet winter, and the dam sits half full while the flood runs past it to the sea. Take too much, and the river below the weir suffers, and there are farms down there, and towns, and an estuary that needs fresh water reaching it to stay alive. Every one of the 6 dams has a version of this problem. Vemmershoek supplies the city and also feeds a branch line out to Paarl and Wellington. The Berg River Dam, the newest of them, regulates the very river that Fuelfle draws from. Water released for one purpose is measured against water withheld from another. The system is not a set of buckets. It is a set of negotiations, running continuously in cubic meters. And the largest negotiation of all is not with a town or a river. Of every drop stored in this system, roughly 2/3 is allocated to Cape Town. Around 1/3 goes to agriculture, the orchards and vineyards of the Berg River Valley, Franschhoek, Grabau, the Lower Berg. A small remainder supplies the surrounding towns. The city and the farms drink from the same 6 dams. They always have. Their allocations are set by the national department that owns the bulk scheme, and neither can take more without the other having less. Hold on to that. It becomes the whole story later. But the largest single loss in this system is not evaporation, and it is not the farms. Some of it happens on a mountainside, long before the water ever reaches a dam. The rest happens after the water has already been cleaned, treated, chlorinated, and paid for. Start with the mountainside. Walk into the catchment above Vemmershoek, and at first, it looks like exactly what a water catchment should look like. Steep slopes, deep green, trees. The trees are the problem. They are pines, gums, and wattles, plantation species brought in from Australia and the Northern Hemisphere, which escaped and spread across the mountains over more than a century. And they do something the vegetation they replaced does not do. They drink. The native cover in these mountains is fynbos, low, hard-leaved, fine-stemmed shrubland, adapted to a place where water arrives in 3 months and then stops. It is built for scarcity. Small leaves, shallow demand, minimal transpiration through a long, dry summer. A mature pine is built for somewhere else entirely. It is tall, deeply rooted, and heavily leaved, and it transpires enormous volumes of water through a season, pulling moisture out of the soil and releasing it to the air as vapor. Water that would otherwise have kept flowing downhill into a stream, and from the stream into a dam. The measured figure is difficult to absorb. Across the catchments feeding Cape Town, invasive trees have been consuming an estimated 55 billion litres of water a year. That is roughly 2 months of supply for the entire city, taken every year. Before a single drop reaches a reservoir, before anyone is asked to shorten a shower, before any pump is switched on. And the water they drink is only the first cost. Dense stands of pine and eucalyptus change the way a mountainside burns. They carry far more fuel than fynbos does, and they carry it high off the ground, so a fire in an invaded catchment burns hotter and travels further than the fires this landscape evolved alongside. Fynbos is built to burn and return on a cycle of many years. It is not built for that. And after a fire of that intensity, the soil is left bare and water repellent, and the first heavy winter rain strips it off the slope and carries it downhill, into the streams, and out of the streams into the dams. Silt that settles on a reservoir floor does not leave again. Every ton of it permanently displaces a ton of water the dam can hold. Jasper Slingsby, a biological scientist at the University of Cape Town, put the case bluntly in the aftermath of the crisis. The invasive plants in these mountains were a larger threat to the city's water supply than climate change was. And unlike the climate, they were something the city could actually go out and fix. So they went out and fixed some of it. Clearing crews work the catchments above Vemmershoek, Steenbras, the Berg River, and Tewaterskloof, cutting by hand in terrain too steep and too broken for machinery. Some of them rope down cliff faces with saws to reach stands growing on ground no vehicle will ever touch. Cut stumps are treated so they cannot resprout. Then the crews come back, year after year, because a cleared slope reseeds itself from the surrounding hills within a few seasons. More than 40,000 hectares have been cleared. The city's own accounting puts the water returned at around 18 billion litres a year, some 50 million litres a day, arriving in the dams from work done with chainsaws on a mountainside. Kate Snadden samples the rivers that run out of those cleared catchments, measuring what comes back once the pines are gone. Flow returns. So do the small endemic fish that had been squeezed into the last cool, shaded fragments of stream. But the arithmetic is unforgiving. Left alone, the losses were projected to roughly double within a few decades as the invasions thickened. The clearing done so far recovers a fraction of what is being taken, and Slingsby has said plainly that finishing the job would need several times the investment currently going into it. It is one of the stranger facts about this city's water. A meaningful share of it is decided not by rainfall, not by engineering, but by what happens to be growing on a slope 40 kilometers from the nearest tap. Which brings us back to the dam that is not a dam. High above the coast road southeast of the city sit two reservoirs, one above the other. Upper Steenbras and Lower Steenbras. They are the smallest of the six, and by volume, they matter least. By function, they are the strangest infrastructure in the city. 1916. A board of engineers is appointed to solve a problem the city can no longer ignore. Cape Town is growing, and the streams coming off Table Mountain cannot supply it. The board recommends damming the Steenbras River out beyond the mountains to the southeast and piping the water back in. The scheme is built. It is the city's first real reach beyond its own doorstep, and it establishes the habit that defines everything afterwards. When Cape Town needs water, it goes further away to get it. Decades later, engineers looked at those two reservoirs, one sitting several hundred meters above the other, and saw something besides storage. They saw a battery. The principle is simple, and it is the oldest form of large-scale energy storage there is. When electricity is cheap and demand is low, through the small hours, between roughly 11 at night and 7 in the morning, the station uses grid power to pump water from the lower reservoir up to the upper one. That water now holds energy purely by virtue of being high up. When demand spikes, The valves open. Water falls back down through 4 turbines and generates electricity on command within minutes. It was the first pumped storage hydroelectric scheme built anywhere on the African continent, around 180 megawatts, and Cape Town remains the only city in South Africa that owns and operates a large one, which produces a genuinely unusual arrangement. The drinking water and the electricity supply are the same water. When the national grid is under strain and the country is being cut in rotating blocks, a stage of load shedding here, another stage there, Cape Town can reach for Steenbras and hold its own customers a stage or two above the rest. Not because the city has more generation than anyone else, because it has a hill, 2 reservoirs, and the pipes between them. The limit is physical and absolute. The amount of electricity the scheme can deliver in a day is capped by the capacity of the lower reservoir. You cannot generate what you have not first lifted. Run it too hard, and the lower dam fills, the upper empties, and the battery is flat until the pumps have had a night to reset it. And on the same site, in the last few years, something else has been drilled into the ground. Boreholes. 15 and more of them, sunk beside the Steenbras dams, reaching between 150 and 350 meters down into the Table Mountain Group aquifer. A vast, fractured sandstone formation running beneath these mountains, holding water in cracks and fissures rather than in open space. The first of it reached the supply network in 2020. The boreholes currently installed can lift something in the order of 10 million litres a day, with the potential to roughly double as more are completed. It flows in through Steenbras and down to Foray, joining the same treated stream as the dam water. But the aquifer is not an empty vault waiting to be drained. These mountains hold the Cape Floral Kingdom, the smallest and richest of the world's floral kingdoms, with a density of species found nowhere else on Earth. Many of those plants are not fed by rainfall alone. They are groundwater dependent, rooted into seeps and springs that exist only because the water table sits where it sits. Draw the aquifer down too far, and those seeps stop. The plants above them do not move, and they do not have anywhere else to go. So the boreholes are metered, monitored, and rested. The abstraction is managed against ecological limits rather than against demand. It is another negotiation, conducted in cubic meters, this time with something that cannot argue back. Everything so far has been about getting water to the city. The harder problem is what happens to it once it arrives. Beneath Cape Town runs something in the order of 11,000 kilometers of water pipe. Cast iron laid generations ago, asbestos cement from the middle of the last century. Modern plastic in the newer suburbs. Pump stations, reservoirs, valves, meters, pressure zones. A network assembled in layers over more than 100 years, most of it invisible, none of it new all at once. And it leaks. The city's own estimate is that roughly 23% of the water entering that network never reaches a paying tap. Some of it is genuinely lost, seeping out of joints and hairline cracks into the sand beneath the streets, never surfacing, never reported, never seen. Some is unmetered, unbilled, or unaccounted for in other ways. Close to a quarter. Water lifted out of a dam behind a mountain, pushed through a tunnel, treated at 3 in the morning, chlorinated, and pumped across a city, and then simply gone. Which is where the single most effective instrument in the whole crisis came from. It was not a new dam, it was not desalination, it was pressure. Peter Flower, who directed the city's water and sanitation operations through those years, ran a program that sounds almost too simple to work. Reduce the pressure in the mains. The physics is what makes it powerful. Flow out of any opening, a tap, a showerhead, a crack in a pipe, depends on the pressure driving it. Lower the pressure, and every single outlet in the zone delivers less, all at once, without anyone being asked to do anything, without a single valve being closed on a single household. And leaks respond even more strongly than taps do. A crack under pressure is being actively pushed open. Drop the pressure, and the leakage rate falls faster than consumption does. bursts become rarer too, because it is pressure that fatigues an old pipe until it fails. So one intervention did three things simultaneously. It cut what people used, it cut what the network lost, and it slowed the rate at which the network was destroying itself. Zones were identified across the city. Contractors were brought in to accelerate the rollout. In the high-lying suburbs, where pressure was already marginal, the reduction was severe enough that supply became intermittent for parts of the day. The taps ran, then thinned, then ran again. Alongside it came everything else. Restrictions escalated in steps, each one tightening the definition of what water was for. Watering gardens with drinking water was banned outright. Filling pools, washing cars, hosing paving, all gone. The personal allowance was cut to 87 litres per person per day, and then to 50. 50 litres is less than 4 full flushes of a conventional toilet. Tariffs rose steeply, and not evenly. The price per litre climbed sharply once a household passed a threshold, so that the cost fell hardest on the highest users rather than being smeared across everyone equally. Water management devices were fitted to properties with persistently high consumption, physically capping daily flow rather than relying on a bill arriving weeks later. And the city published everything: consumption maps, weekly figures, household-level comparisons that let a street see itself against its neighbours. The result is, by some distance, the sharpest demand reduction any large city has achieved in peacetime. In February of 2015, Cape Town was drawing around 1,200 million litres a day. By February of 2018, it was drawing close to 500. More than half. In 3 years. The International Water Association named it the world's leading water-saving city, and noted the detail that makes the achievement unusual. It was done without ever resorting to full intermittent supply across the metro. The taps kept running. They simply ran with less behind them. There is a habit that grew out of those years and never went away. Every Monday afternoon, a figure is published. The combined dam level, updated against a model that is now rebuilt weekly. Consumption, storage, projected inflow, projected evaporation, the rate of change over the preceding weeks. Before the crisis, the city's water position was something a small number of specialists tracked. Now it is a public instrument, running continuously, watched by people who will never work in the industry. The countdown, in other words, was not switched off when the rain came. It was institutionalized. It became the thing the city looks at, every week, forever. And that instrument reveals something uncomfortable when you hold it up against the present. Cape Town today has roughly 5 million people and draws in the region of 1,000 million litres a day through its summer months. That works out at something over 200 litres per person per day, against a global average nearer 120 to 160. The city that broke every record for saving water has, over the years since, drifted back up. Though the figure needs care. It includes the 23% lost in the pipes, which is not consumption by anyone. Strip that out, and the number falls close to the international norm, and the loss becomes a network problem rather than a behaviour problem, which is exactly what it is. But the average conceals something more important than that. Because Cape Town does not have one water system, it has two, running through the same pipes. In a formal house, water arrives through a metered connection, indoors, on demand, at whatever hour it is wanted. There is a kitchen tap, a bathroom, a cistern, a hot water cylinder, and very often a garden and something to fill in it. In an informal settlement, water arrives at a communal standpipe in the open. The design standard the city works to is one tap for roughly every 25 households, within about 200 metres of a dwelling. That is the standard. The reality on the ground varies considerably from it. In some settlements, a handful of standpipes serve tens of thousands of people. Taps break, and the wait for a repair can be long. When taps fail, residents walk to a neighbouring settlement, or they queue. The arithmetic that follows is the part worth sitting with. Formal households account for around 2/3 of everything the city consumes. Informal settlements house something in the region of 1/5 of Cape Town's households and use around 4% of its water. In some of those settlements, daily use runs at roughly 10 litres per person. In parts of the city with gardens and pools, it has run at several hundred. So when Cape Town was told to cut to 50 litres a person, the instruction landed on two entirely different populations. For a household with a lawn, a pool, and 2 bathrooms, 50 litres was a severe and genuine sacrifice. For a household already living on 10, 50 litres was not a restriction at all. It was more than they had ever had. This is not a moral observation. It is a structural one, and it explains the mechanics of the saving. The demand reduction that pulled Cape Town back from the threshold came overwhelmingly out of the part of the city that had discretionary water to surrender. Gardens stopped being watered. Pools were covered. Showers were timed. There was never any equivalent margin at the other end of the network because there had never been any surplus there to begin with. And for those households, a version of day zero was not a projection on a calendar. Queuing at a shared tap with a container and carrying it home and making it last was already the ordinary condition of getting water. The rest of the city spent the summer of 2018 rehearsing it. Then the system produced a problem nobody had planned for. The sewers stopped moving. A sewer is not a pipe that water is pushed through. It is a channel that runs downhill, and it works on gravity and volume. Solids do not travel on their own. They are carried by the flow of water around them. Take enough water out of a household, stop flushing, shorten showers, run less down every drain in the building, and the flow through the sewer beneath the street drops with it. Below a certain volume, the water no longer carries. Solids settle. They accumulate against the low points and the bends. Grease that would have been swept through cools and hardens instead, and binds everything else to it. And so the city's reported sewer blockages climbed steadily through those years, from an average of around 290 a day to around 330. Some of that was misuse, the things people put into a sewer that should never go into one. But the drought was pushing in the same direction the whole time, and the effect was cumulative. Less flow, more settling, more blockages, more overflows into streets and canals and stormwater drains. The response was one of the strangest measures taken anywhere in the crisis. Crews went out and opened holes in sewer lines deliberately. So that groundwater sitting in the sandy soil of the Cape Flats would seep in through the breach and add volume to the flow, using the water table beneath the city to keep the city's waste moving, because the residents above it were no longer sending enough down. It is a small thing, and it went almost entirely unreported, but it is the clearest statement of what a system actually is. Cape Town spent 3 years learning to use less water, and discovered that below a certain point, using less water breaks the machinery that takes the water away. Nothing here works alone. It is worth pausing on what the rest of the world took from all this. The story travelled fast, and it travelled in one shape. A city was about to run out of water. There had been a drought. The drought was the villain, and the moral was that the climate is changing and cities must prepare. All of that is true, and it is the least interesting thing about what happened here. Because a drought is only a problem for a system built to be surprised by one. Rainfall in this corner of Africa has always been erratic. What made 3 dry winters nearly fatal was not their severity. It was the shape of the thing they landed on. Consider what Cape Town's supply actually was on the eve of the crisis. 6 dams, all of them surface storage, all exposed to the sun and the wind. All of them fed by rain in a single 3-month window across one weather system. Water shared with an agricultural sector under the same allocation. A network losing close to a quarter of everything it carried. Six reservoirs, and functionally, 1 point of failure. It was not a system with too little water. It was a system with only one way of being wrong. And it had been built that way deliberately by people making reasonable decisions. 2009. The gates close on the Berg River Dam, the newest of the six, 130 million cubic meters of new storage. It is the last major dam Cape Town builds. After that, the strategy shifts. Rather than pursuing further large storage, expensive, slow, ecologically contested, and increasingly hard to site, the city leans on conservation and demand management to close the gap between a growing population and a fixed supply. And it worked, for a while. Cape Town's population rose sharply through those years, and total demand stayed remarkably flat. That is a genuine achievement in water management, and it was recognized as one at the time. But a flat demand curve on a single-source supply is still a single-source supply. Efficiency had bought time. It had not bought a second way to fail. Which is precisely what the city has spent the years since trying to buy. The program has a plain name, the New Water Program, and a plain target. Around 300 million litres a day of new supply, from sources that do not depend on rain, phased in across the coming years. Groundwater is the largest piece. 3 aquifers, the Table Mountain Group in the mountains, and beneath the city itself, the Cape Flats and Atlantis aquifers, with dozens of production boreholes drilled into each. Together, they are intended to deliver in excess of 100 million litres a day. At Atlantis, on the sandy plain north of the city, the aquifer is not simply being drawn from, it is being fed. Treated wastewater and stormwater are diverted into shallow recharge basins on the surface, where the water soaks down through the sand and rejoins the groundwater beneath. The sand itself does the polishing on the way through. Later, that same water is pumped back up from a well field further along the flow path and put into supply. It is storage without a dam. Nothing evaporates because nothing is left standing in the sun. Water reuse is the second. At Foray, alongside the existing treatment works, a scheme is designed to take treated wastewater and put it through advanced purification, membrane filtration, oxidation, disinfection, until it meets drinking standard and return it to the network. 70 million litres a day, with room to grow. It is the cheapest of the new sources by a wide margin, and it has one property none of the others have. Its supply does not vary with the weather at all. A city produces wastewater in proportion to how much water it uses. The drier it gets, the more valuable that becomes. The cost gap is not marginal. Purified reuse runs at roughly 60% of what seawater desalination costs to produce, and sits close to the price of drawing groundwater, while asking considerably less of the coastline and the aquifers than either. The obstacle has never really been the engineering, it is whether people will drink it. And then desalination. A permanent plant planned at Pardon Island on the working edge of the harbour, sized at up to 70 million litres a day, with a second site under evaluation further up the west coast, seawater is pushed at very high pressure through membranes with pores fine enough to hold back dissolved salt while letting water molecules through. It is the most reliable source available. The Atlantic does not have a dry season, and by a considerable distance the most expensive, because forcing water through those membranes takes a great deal of electricity, continuously, forever. Which returns the city to Steenbras, and to the fact underneath all of this. Making water takes power. Moving water takes power. The more of its supply Cape Town manufactures rather than collects, the more tightly its water is bound to its electricity, and the more the hill above the coast road matters. Today, something close to 98% of Cape Town's water still comes off the surface, out of those 6 dams. The stated intention is to bring that down towards 3/4 within the next decade and a half, with the remainder made, pumped, or recovered. That is the plan. It is measured in billions and in decades. None of it existed in the summer of 2018. So we come to the question this whole documentary has been walking towards. If the desalination plant was not built, the aquifers were barely drilled, the reuse scheme was still a design on paper, and the rain had not yet come, what actually stopped the countdown? The answer is 40 kilometers east of the city, in a valley of apple and pear orchards called Grabau. The Groenland Valley sits in the mountains above the coast, and it is one of the most productive deciduous fruit districts in the country. Its farmers hold water rights of their own, administered through a water user association, and they store what they are entitled to in their own farm dams, private storage held on private land for private use. That water was not the city's. It had never been the city's. Under the allocation that governs the whole scheme, it belonged to the orchards. And by that point in the season, the orchards were in serious trouble. Agricultural allocations across the supply system had been cut savagely as the drought deepened, reductions running from around 60% to, in the worst-hit reaches of the lower Berg, close to 90%. Some irrigation boards had simply exhausted their quota, and at the end of February, the national department stopped releasing water to those that had. What that means on a farm is specific and irreversible. When irrigation falls below roughly half of what a fruit tree needs, profitable farming stops. Growers strip fruit off the trees to reduce the water the tree demands. They pull out their least productive orchards to keep water for the rest. In the worst cases, they cut the tree back to the trunk and try to keep the root system alive, hoping to rebuild it over years. A vineyard or an orchard is not a crop planted in spring and lost in autumn. It is 15 or 20 years of investment standing in the ground. Across the Western Cape, the drought is estimated to have cost agriculture in the region of 5.5 billion rand and around 30,000 jobs. Tens of thousands of seasonal workers were not taken on. In an industry employing several 100,000 people, that loss moved through farming towns that had no other employer. And it was into that situation that the request went. Through February of 2018, with the city's dams around a quarter full and the projected shutdown date sitting weeks away, negotiations ran between the city, the provincial authorities, the national department that owns the bulk system, and the farmers themselves. Trevor Balzer, leading the national drought response, was among those coordinating it at a technical level, the unglamorous work of making 3 spheres of government and a private water user association agree on a number. The agreement reached was for 7 million cubic metres. 7 billion litres of water released out of the Groenland farmers' own dams, out of their own allocation, and given over to the city. And then came the physical problem. The water was in the wrong valley. Grabau sits on the far side of a watershed from Upper Steenbras, and water does not cross a watershed on its own. It had to be lifted, pumped up and over the ridge against gravity into the city's reservoir, which required power, a great deal of it sustained over days. So the transfer was carried out with the national electricity utility, supplying what was needed to run the pumps that pushed a private farming district's water over a mountain and into a municipal dam. Stand back and look at what that sentence contains. The rescue of a city of 4 million people at the last practical moment depended on rain that had fallen years earlier in a fruit-growing valley, on farmers agreeing to give up water they were legally entitled to and economically desperate for, on a national department arbitrating between them and the city, on a power utility that was itself under severe strain finding the electricity to run the pumps, and on a set of pipes and a reservoir built in the 1920s for an entirely different purpose. Remove any one of those, and the arithmetic does not work. The transfer, together with the wider curtailment of agricultural releases, is credited with pushing the projected date back by around a month. 1 month, bought with orchards. And that month was decisive, because it carried the city into the point in the calendar where cold fronts begin arriving off the Atlantic. The winter rains came. The dams began to rise. In June, the level passed 40%, and by September it was approaching 70%, and the restrictions were eased, and the date was withdrawn. The world recorded that Cape Town had been saved by rain. The city had, in fact, been carried to the rain, by pressure reductions in 11,000 kilometres of pipe, by 50 litres a person, by tariffs and management devices, and a published map of who was using what, by the clearing of trees on distant mountainsides, and, in the final weeks, by 7 billion litres of water that belonged to somebody else. This is what the countdown was actually counting, not litres in a dam. Every dependency in the chain, resolving in time or not. What happened afterwards is less dramatic and in some ways more revealing. The dams filled, the restrictions lifted, and the hardest, least visible problem in the system stayed exactly where it was. 11,253 kilometres of pipe. The city spends in the region of 460 million rand a year simply keeping that network running, finding leaks, repairing bursts, replacing valves, maintaining pump stations and reservoirs. In a recent 6-month stretch, close to 22,000 individual leaks were repaired. That is not a failure of effort, it is the scale of the thing. The deeper measure is the replacement rate, how much of the network is dug up and renewed each year. The internationally recommended figure is around 2%, which implies replacing the whole system roughly every 50 years, because that is about how long buried pipe lasts. Cape Town currently replaces around 1%, roughly 50 kilometres a year, against a network of 11,000. At 1%, the network is being renewed on a 100-year cycle, which means that on average, pipe is being asked to last twice as long as pipe lasts. Every year that gap persists, the ageing fraction of the network grows and the losses embedded in it grow with it. It is the least photogenic problem in the entire water system, and quite possibly the most consequential. Because a quarter of the supply disappearing underground is, in effect, a quarter of every dam, every tunnel, every borehole, and every future desalination plant working for nothing. There are smaller programs running against it, and some of them are unusually direct.
City now pays to repair internal plumbing leaks inside qualifying low-income households, a running toilet system, a corroded pipe under a floor, at no cost to the resident, on the reasoning that a household drowning in a bill it cannot pay will not fix a leak, and the water is lost either way. Automated consumption monitoring flags the properties. Contractors are sent, the leak is closed. It is a very small intervention against a very large number, but it is the correct shape of intervention, treating the network, the household and the bill as parts of the same machine, because they are. Stand at T-Water's Kloof now and the water is back. The white sand is under it again. The drowned tree stumps are under it again, hidden the way they were hidden for 50 years before anybody photographed them. The dam looks the way a dam is supposed to look, and nothing structural about the position has changed as much as that surface suggests. The city still takes almost all of its water off the surface, out of 6 reservoirs, filled by rain that arrives in one 3-month window across one weather system, shared with the farms that grow its food. It still loses close to a quarter of what it treats. It still replaces its pipes at half the rate the pipes require. It still uses more per person than most cities of its size and wealth. What it has now that it did not have then is a set of instruments and a set of intentions. A weekly published number that nobody can ignore. Aquifers coming online. A reuse scheme designed. A desalination plant planned. Crews on the mountainsides taking out the pines. A population that lived through it and has not entirely forgotten. Whether that is enough is not a question anyone can answer from here. What Cape Town demonstrated is smaller than the lesson the world drew from it, and harder. Not that a city can run out of water. Cities have always known that. What Cape Town demonstrated is that a modern water supply is not a quantity. It is a chain. Rain on the correct mountain, in the correct months, held behind concrete, carried through rock, cleaned in the dark, pushed along 11,000 kilometres of pipe at exactly the right pressure, shared out under an allocation agreed with people who grow food, flushed away through channels that need volume to function, and paid for by a system of bills and tariffs that has to hold together for any of the rest of it to be maintained. Every link is somebody's job. Most of them are invisible, and the chain is only ever as strong as its most neglected part.
The countdown that ran through the summer of 2018 was never really counting water. It was counting how much longer a set of arrangements could hold. Arrangements between a city and a mountain range. Between a city and its farmers. Between a city and the pipes beneath its own streets. Those arrangements held, narrowly, with a month bought from an orchard. They are still holding. And every Monday afternoon, the number is published again. And somewhere in an office above a city of 5 million people, somebody reads it and decides whether this is a week to do nothing or a week to begin. Thank you for watching. If you would like to keep traveling with us, consider subscribing. Until the next journey.